right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable on anti-Asian racism in Canada today. This event is hosted by CFRAC, and since its establishment in 1993, the Center for Race and Culture, which was formerly known as Northern Alberta Alliance on Race Relations, has brought together diverse people with an interest in promoting and supporting individual, collective, and systemic change to address discrimination and racism and to encourage intercultural understanding. Taking an intersectional approach, our expertise spans workplace development, community building, research, and education. If you would like to learn more about current events, projects, or activities, please visit our website or sign up for our newsletter. This roundtable is part of an initiative called Challenging Discrimination Through Community Conversations. This is an ongoing series of online moderated roundtables and webinars with guest speakers from diverse communities, organizations, academia, and the general public. By shining the spotlight on different forms of discrimination, such as anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and discrimination against Asian communities, amongst other topics, we hope to encourage solidarity among groups and individuals interested in promoting social inclusion and equity. This is a community-based initiative, and we welcome ideas and suggestions for collaboration. So please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or my colleague Mansouri if you would like to be part of our future conversations. You can also use the feedback form at the end, which we'll share with you to let us know about any ideas, questions, or thoughts that you may have. Even though we are not gathered in the same physical space today, we would like to acknowledge the land that CFRAC occupies on Treaty 6 territory, traditional homelands for many Indigenous peoples. With this acknowledgement, we pay our respect to the elders past and present who call this land home, and remind all of us gathered here today of the responsibilities we have as treaty people to understand our shared colonial history and to work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all peoples. At the Center for Race and Culture, we are trying to go beyond a formal land acknowledgement and connect it to our current socio-political milieu in Canada and consider our parts as individuals responding to acts of discrimination and moving towards a more inclusive society. Today, I would like to introduce you to a remarkable solidarity mask project, which centers on Asian and Indigenous pandemic experiences. This mask project is bringing Indigenous Asian creators together to make art that expresses how their respective communities are navigating a public health crisis and the negative side effects it has on their communities. It was about finding our commonalities so that we could support each other and raise our voices louder together instead of just being silenced by the world, says Tanya Larson, who is the project creator. Larson reached out in solidarity. She understood that for Asian and Indigenous communities, the dangers of the pandemic stretched beyond respiratory illness. The masks, through their design, touch on decolonization, liberation, healing, displacement from ancestral lands, and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I will share a link to the project with you in just a minute. And in the meantime, we would like to ask you to please participate in our poll. We are just collecting anonymous demographic data. And the idea is to just give us a better idea who our audience is. So if you could please participate, it will just take a minute. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our panelists today. Sharon Yu. She is a director at Catholic Social Services in Edmonton. She has more than 15 years experience in the settlement sector, welcoming newcomers and developing programs that support the integration of immigrants and refugees. Sharon is also an active community volunteer, having organized walking tours and pop-up events in Chinatown. More recently, she co-founded Chinatown Dining Week in 2018, and I will hand it over here to Sharon.
Thanks, Miriam, and thanks to CFRAC for having me as the moderator of the panel today. I know there have been some comments about the sound quality, so hopefully the sound quality will improve from now forward. But it is my pleasure to introduce my fellow panelists today, starting with Vivian Kwan. Vivian Kwan currently works as the Planning and Engagement Coordinator with Homeward Trust, a nonprofit organization committed to ending homelessness in our city, and as a consultant with the Mental Health Commission of Canada. She graduated with a Bachelor of Science in 2015 and will be receiving her Master's of Public Health degree this coming May. As a first-generation university student and the eldest child in a traditional Chinese family, Vivian recognized the importance to have open dialogue and normalized conversations about mental health in racialized communities. Over the years, she has been working to raise awareness and encourage open mental health dialogue in diverse communities through her various roles. Next, we have Sam Louis Poon. She is a nurse, researcher, and a board member at the Center for Race and Culture. She is passionate about social activism, promoting justice, and building community capacity. Sam holds a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, has worked clinically as a pediatric nurse, and has held various positions locally and globally in nonprofit and non-governmental organizations. Currently, Sam is pursuing a Doctor of Philosophy degree with the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Alberta. Sam's research work is geared towards addressing anti-Asian racism in child mental health evidence-based resources. Specifically, Sam will be exploring how the healthcare sector can seek impactful solutions that integrate anti-racism as a key commitment in the development and provision of mental health resources for Asian parents. Last but not least, we have Jing Wu. She is a program and services designer at Diverse Cities, formerly Calgary Chinese Community Services Association. She graduated from the University of Calgary with a PhD in chemical engineering in 2020. Her strong passion and own immigrant experiences have drawn her to work in the non-for-profit sector. When observing an alarming increase in racial discrimination in the Asian community during the COVID-19 pandemic, she took the lead of an anti-racism project at Diverse Cities from September 2020. So thank you so much for joining us today for this panel. We thought we would start it off by each of us providing an introduction to our own background, just to give you some context of where we fit in this conversation. We know there are lots of intersecting identities that could play a role in this complex issue of anti-racism discrimination, anti-Asian racism. So we wanted to sort of set the context with the four of us. So I will start, and then I will pass it off to each of the panelists. As Miriam introduced, I am Sharon Yeo. My Chinese name is Yang Xiaoyun. My parents came to Canada in the early 80s. They immigrated here from a country called Brunei, where the Chinese community is a minority in that country. They came to Canada, and myself and my two sisters were born in Canada. I choose to refer to myself as a second generation, as opposed to, I know most frequently, someone who was born in Canada might be referred to as first generation, but for me, it negates, for my parents, the struggle that they had in establishing roots here. And I choose to acknowledge that by saying that they are first generation and I am second generation. I have a daughter who's 3. She is half Chinese. And so it will be interesting for her to navigate life as a half Asian, half Caucasian girl and trying to find her identity kind of in between. So that will be interesting as we support her in exploring both sides of that heritage and see what that means to her as she grows up. So I would like to pass it off to Vivian next.
Thank you, Sharon. As Sharon has mentioned, I currently work in the public sector and I wear a number of hats. So a bit about my personal background. I was born and raised in Canada with my brother, who is 4 years younger than me, in Edmonton, Alberta. My parents immigrated from Hong Kong back in 1980s, and my grandma from my mom's side actually immigrated to Canada through the caregivers program back when I was 3 or 4. So the majority of my dad's side of the family are currently in Canada, but most of my mom's side of her family are still in Hong Kong and also in Guangdong, mainland China. And I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be here and speak to everybody today. It has been quite an experience, really navigating all these emotions in light of the recent and some of the ongoing events. And we're definitely at a critical point in time where speaking up against racism is so important. And I am very excited to be joined by such a great team for these conversations today. So I'll pass it off to Sam.
Thanks, Vivian. We're gonna have Jing go next and then Sam go last, if that's possible. So Jing, go ahead, please. Thank you.
For sure. Thank you, Shara. My name is Jing, and I'm from China, Xi'an, China, to continue my graduate program at University of Calgary in 2015. So I'm definitely a new immigrant, I would say, and I completed my PhD in chemical engineering last year during pandemic. And also because I traveled from China to Canada in February last year, that is really what the outbreak happened in China and did not happen in Canada yet. So at that time, myself, I experienced some kind of exclusion in my communities and also in my work as well. So I kind of have a sense that, wow, it happened, but I never think we have racial kind of discriminations in Canada. I always think it's very friendly communities in Canada, but it changed my mind. So that's why I started doing some research projects in about social integrations in working school of education in UC, and also doing some other work at U of A as well. So meanwhile, I really want to see what the frontline worker experiences will be like. So I took the lead for an anti-racism project started last year, September. And I think I'm so glad that I know I can get in touch with the community members and a lot of amazing teams of social providers to really discuss more deep what is the need of the community and what we can do more for the community. So I'm really happy to share all my learnings and maybe discuss more with all of you today. Thank you so much for the invitation. And next, Sam.
Perfect, thank you. As Sharon said, my name is Sam. My Chinese name is Siwan. I just want to first say thank you to CFRAC for holding this space for us to talk about this important topic. And in terms of my self-location, I identify as a settler of Chinese ancestry here on Treaty 6 territory. And I just want to take a moment just to highlight that we're all speaking from the self-identities of East Asians. And often the idea of East Asians becomes sort of a default when we're talking about the Asian experience. So it's important to note that while we all identify as Asian here on this panel today, we collectively are all here as settlers here on Turtle Island, and we don't actually account for the significant diverseness of all Asian voices and the other ways that other Asian experiences actually add to the conversation on anti-Asian racism.
Thanks, Sam. So we wanted to start off the more formal part of this panel by just defining the terms. I think Sam's already alluded a little bit to the fact that there is quite a bit of diversity in the term of Asian Canadians. But I wanted to ask Sam if she can comment about who is included in the term Asian Canadians and maybe who is excluded in that term. What is your definition of Asian Canadian?
Perfect, thanks, Sharon. So in Canada, the term Asian is often tied to the notion of East Asians, like I said earlier. So Asians from countries like China, Korea, and Japan. But the term Asians within Canada is much more inclusive and diverse than this. And often in Canadian culture, we tend to not conceptualize Asians equally when we should be. So when we're talking about Asian Canadians, it really includes Asians from multiple subgroups from Asia. So West Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia as well. And in addition to these kind of subgroup regions, it also includes Asians at the intersection of diverse factors. So Asians who practice various religious practices, brown Asians, Black Asians, disabled Asians, non-binary and trans Asians, also LGBTQ plus Asians, economically disadvantaged Asians, undocumented Asians, or Asians with precarious immigration status. So we can see that it's very diverse when we're talking about Asian Canadians, and there's a significant benefit for including Asians of all backgrounds within this umbrella idea of Asians. And that's just to prevent the erasure of certain experiences and people within this group. So it's important to remember that Asians are not a monolith. So when we're talking about Asians, it's important to understand the unique differences within the idea that we classify Asians in order to meet the distinct needs of everyone included in this group.
Thanks, Sam, for that very nuanced conversation around being inclusive with that term. I have one follow-up question. Often in the mainstream media, the term that's most popular in usage is BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous persons of color. In your opinion, are Asians included in that term?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a quite popular term nowadays. But from my perspective, Asians are included in this term because Asians are people of color. Often, sometimes something called the model minority myth kind of denotes the idea that Asians are kind of like an honorary white people, but we're not. We're people of color. So yeah, I would say that Asian Canadians are included in this so-called broad term of BIPOC.
Thank you. Myrna, can you get the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So we also thought, in addition to definition, something that is helpful for the context is just going through some of the policies that have helped shape where we are today. So I wanted to pose this question to Vivian. So something that has become apparent in this upswing of anti-Asian sentiment is that not all Canadians are aware of Canada's history of racist policies towards Asians. Can you tell us about some of these policies?
Yes, most definitely. So I believe we can all agree that racism against Asians have been entrenched for centuries, and we really need to look at how history has brought us to the point we are at today, because we cannot talk about anti-Asian racism and xenophobia as separate topics. So a couple of the important dates that you see on the slides right now, the Chinese Exclusion Act is a huge, probably a very memorable event for most of like a Chinese Canadian community. And before we really talk about the Exclusion Act, we have to talk about the head tax as well, which was probably also implemented early in the 1880s to discourage Chinese immigrants from coming to Canada. And when the Exclusion Act really got passed, I believe was like a little bit over in the early 1900s, that's when the Canadian government was outright saying that, like, no, we don't want Chinese immigrants in Canada. And I guess moving forward, Japanese Canadians, like another historical event that really laid a foundation for racism in our country, is the Japanese internment camps in the early Second World War. So we have kind of see the legacy of the internment camps of Japanese Canadian communities being dispersed more in the inner provinces of Alberta. And we still see that a lot today, that the Japanese Canadian communities are concentrated there till this day. So there's a lot of impact of how these policies in Canadian history really brought us to the point we are here today. And it's very heartbreaking. I actually had a very good conversation with my partner's sister. So they are Japanese Canadians and they were originally from Lethbridge. And it's just very interesting talking to her about how like families, different generations are starting to talk about these policies and how they impacted them and the differences of approaching them as a first and second generation Canadian compared to like the fourth generation Canadians. And the intergenerational trauma is really hard to navigate. So it's very heartbreaking to see, and this continues to be a challenge in a lot of racialized communities that has been impacted by such policies.
Sorry, Marina, we just have one more piece on that previous slide. Thank you, Vivian, for giving us a a history lesson on some of the policies that rendered, persons of Asian and Chinese descent as second-class citizens, even though they could have had generational roots in this country for a long time, and bringing up the valuable point about some of the trauma that goes unspoken across generations and maybe swept under the rug, and maybe just in recent times being resurfaced given the current pandemic and a lot of the current anti-Asian racism that has come to the surface again. Just kind of going back with the last piece on this slide is just going back to, again, some of the challenges in the immigration policy prior to 1967 in terms of excluding certain persons from certain countries of origin, or excluding certain newcomers from who had a certain color of skin. And so it really wasn't until 1967 when that changed, and points system of immigration was implemented to be more inclusive of people of race and culture and ethnicity, and not exclude. And so in theory, that system was an improvement on the previous one, in that it assessed people or assigned people points based on a perceived understanding of the fact that they could better integrate. So looking at their age, their educational background, their occupational skills, their proficiency in official language of English or French, as opposed to necessarily where they came from. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was certainly an improvement over the previous one. And so for a long time, even until recent memory, the systems that Canada had in place did not support all newcomers coming to this country, right? So it's just kind of working through and unpacking that history, and again, some of the effects that are still present today. So Myrna, we can go to the next slide now. Thank you. So we wanted to talk a little bit more about what Sam touched on earlier regarding the model minority myth. I think some people might be familiar with this term because in this current reality, that term has been brought up, and there is potentially some exclusion of Asians and Asian Canadians because of this myth. So can I ask you, Sam, to elaborate a little bit more about model minority? Why is this a myth, and why is this a dangerous myth?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I think it's important to maybe provide some context as to why we would need to talk about something like the model minority myth in this larger conversation of anti-Asian racism. So many people right now are attributing the increase in anti-Asian violence with the rhetoric that's being tossed around and emitted in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And while this is true and it has amplified the anti-Asian violence and racism right now, we have to remember that this violence is nothing that's new, and it's existed within Canada's history for quite some time, and it's really manifested itself into the policies and fabric of our society and our institutions, as Vivian highlighted. So it's important to unpack the distinct mechanisms under which this continues to occur in present day. And in order to do this, we have to then interrogate what the model minority myth really is. So the myth was created and really continues to be used as a political tool rooted in white supremacy. So this myth problematically ascribed Asians as being apolitical, as quiet or silent, well-adjusted population, perhaps financially secure, and a highly successful population. But this is only in comparison to other racialized groups. So what these stereotypes do are two fundamental things. So first, it paints Asians as a monolith. So meaning that it doesn't take into consideration the diversity that actually exists within the Asian communities, as we stated earlier. And the second part is it really places Asian communities with sort of a conditional and perceived proximity to whiteness. So what I mean by that, it's like Asians are more readily accepted into white institutions and perceived as this so-called model minority, but simultaneously deemed as a perpetual foreigner or outsider, and essentially used as scapegoats in things like the spread of viruses, which we know is not true. And on the flip side, when we're talking about this perceived proximity to whiteness, it's critical to understand that it's really used as a weapon against other racialized groups under white supremacy. So it's really an idea that's rooted in anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism because it continues to be used in direct opposition to the oppression that Black and Indigenous folks face. So this myth really was a way for the system of white supremacy to drive a wedge between racialized communities in order to maintain and sustain the power of white supremacy. So it's really important in this conversation to hold space for how this myth negatively operates within and among different racialized groups, because we can't be entering this conversation just through one lens. But in light of this talk today, specifically on anti-Asian racism, this myth sort of materializes within the Asian community by assuming that the achievements of a few Asians are a result of their hard work. And this is basically just to endorse the meritocratic ideologies upheld in North American societies. So the ideology of meritocracy really is based off of one's effort and achievements. So the idea that anyone can achieve success if they ultimately work hard, which we know is obviously not true because we have to be looking at sort of the legacies of structural oppression that's impinging on people's ability to do so. So this persistent socialization then of this myth essentially delegitimizes the impacts of racism on Asian diasporas here in Canada. And society then becomes more so desensitized to the violence that Asians experience, because this perceived proximity to whiteness kind of makes Asians no longer to be perceived as a minoritized group. So while this myth can create seemingly positive stereotypes, people can look at it and be like, well, isn't it a positive thing to be deemed as a highly successful group? It doesn't account for the diversity of Asians, and also actually manufactures the conditions which essentially devoid the Asian community of our agency to express experiences of racism. And this essentially just adds to the intergenerational racial trauma that we experience, which impacts how we navigate society, how we perceive ourselves, and internalize the impacts of racism. So essentially, the most prominent thing about the model minority myth for the Asian community specifically is essentially the perpetual erasure of the Asian experience.
Thank you, Sam, for that very thorough unpacking of the layers inherent in the model minority myth. I wanted to ask you one follow-up question because we've been talking today about the intersection of many different factors within the Asian experience, and one that has come to the forefront with the recent shootings in Atlanta, Georgia, is the experience of women and female Asian Canadians. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's an incredible nuance to the model minority myth, especially when we're looking at it from the intersection of different axes of power and subordination. And I think it's really appropriate also to give credit to Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw for giving us the vocabulary and insights necessary to explore these complexities that we're going to be talking about. But in terms of answering your question, for Asians perceived to be women, they're strategically discriminated against under both the model minority myth, so white supremacy, and also the patriarchy, among other intersections, so such as capitalism, precarious immigration status, etc. So this really intersection of racism and sexism essentially renders Asians perceived to be women by creating two different stereotypes about them. So one where they're perceived to be submissive, docile, obedient, and sometimes even weak, and another that stereotypes them as being exotic and hypersexualized, which then leads to the objectification and fetishization of Asians perceived to be women. And this ultimately makes them a bigger target in gendered racist violence, like you said, Sharon, as we have seen in Atlanta with the mass shooting. So because of these multiple oppressive stereotypes that's acting on Asians perceived to be women, they become precariously placed in society, which further endorses the erasure of their experiences and basically silences them. And I think when we're talking about also the gendered lens, we can also see on the flip side that the complex intersection of how toxic masculine norms are also developed within the model minority myth as well. So for Asians perceived to be a man, the added impacts of toxic masculinity also significantly shapes the image that's casted on them. So particularly with the feminization of Asians perceived to be a man, and consequently this can lead to feelings of being emasculated, so that those feelings can emerge under this sort of heteronormative patriarchal agenda that intersects with the model minority myth. So yeah, when we're talking about the model minority myth, it's really necessary to look at it from a gendered perspective or a gendered lens, in addition to other intersections, just to hold space for the nuance and complexity of different social locations and social identity.
Thank you, Sam. So we want to stay on the slide and just talk a little bit more about the current realities. And so I know, Jing, you sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier in your own introduction, but one of the reasons, of course, that has been cited for the increase in the anti-Asian racism currently is due to the origins of COVID-19. And of course, we all remember in the former President Trump popularizing the term China virus or Kung flu. And you just alluded to some very recent racist experiences that you had coming back to Canada last February. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, for sure. So I think I really want to share my personal experiences. I don't know if it's specific to be racial discrimination, but it's kind of my starting point to really consider or really think this topic seriously. So the time that's when I take flight from China to Canada, it takes me over 24 hours in early February. It is actually very serious in China with all those coronavirus happened at that time. So I was afraid to be affected by coronavirus during the flight for the 24 hours, and also afraid to be spread the virus to others, either in Canada or China. So I was protect myself very well with all what I can, and within the limited knowledge I know about coronavirus at that time. So I took my luggage and then I want to buy a monthly pass in downtown area. So I have really big luggage with me and to waiting in line and get the pass. And at that time, it's my first time realize that people just stare at me and they're discussing or whispering around me, but I don't know what does that mean. And they were not friendly at all. So actually, that is the first time I think of maybe my perspective of what a Canadian people was like changed at that moment. So I did quarantine myself 14 days when I landed in Calgary, and I did my best to protect my friend around me. And also after that, I realized more serious kind of situation or cases happened in Canada, in Calgary, or around the world. So I think it's very lucky to continue kind of campaign for Asians within Calgary, within my organizations. And I think with my kind of frontline workers' experiences, I know more deeper about what happened with others as well. So I want to share, first of all, share some statistic reports I found during kind of the first 3 months from March to June, during the 3 months of COVID happened. So actually this report, a survey was released on CBC News. So the online report of 516 Chinese Canadians suggests that 43% of people who identified as Chinese Canadian said they had been threatened or intimidated since the pandemic began. and more than 60% said they had adjusted their routines to avoid run-ins or otherwise unpleasant encounter. So I think from my own observation of work experiences, I do believe that this data makes sense. So some stories that I heard from our phone call I think we did call over 200 clients back in September to November last year. So some of them report Chinese people started to wear masks or isolation themselves at home in early February to protect them and their families from being affected by coronavirus, and also from possible spreading the virus. But other locals did not fully understand the reason for doing that. So they were constantly racism slurs or physical attack happened around that time. So that is some messages that I heard from the multiple clients. And also more hate incident actually happened in the public transit during coronavirus. I know that two stories. One is with my landlord. He's a senior, Chinese senior with language barriers. I think 2 or 3 youths use chemical kind of on the citron. So my landlord eyes hurt badly, but at the end, he's not comfortable to report to the police, Calgary police. So I think that is the time I realized maybe because Asians or Chinese culture, their collective culture, and those people are used to stay within their own comfort zone and not be able to speak up with their limited language proficiencies. So I think maybe I should kind of speak for them and try to show them what they can do, how they can protect themselves. And if I also have 2 resources, if you want to know more stories of what happened, I will just send the link to the chat for your reference after this meeting.
Thanks, Jing, for sharing your own experiences as well as statistics. And I know statistics have often, helped sort of convey the quantity or the volume of incidents, but I think personal experiences like the ones that you shared really help people understand the sorts of things that are happening in our own communities, because sometimes it seems that it might be happening in other places like the US or in other parts of Canada, but not necessarily here in Alberta. And so thanks for providing some very troubling things that have happened very close to home. So the last sort of piece that we did want to cover today, and so Myrna, if you would like to stop sharing, thank you so much. We wanted to leave this conversation not necessarily without hope. So I mean, I think it's very encouraging that all of you have chosen to join us today to learn more about some of the anti-Asian racism that has been experienced firsthand and some of the history associated with the Asian population in Canada. And so we wanted to each of us share an example of something that can help you learn more about Asian Canadians or something you can do. So I will invite Vivian to start, and then Sam, and then Jing. So go ahead, Vivian, please.
Thank you, Sharon. So there's a lot from the grassroots levels to, of course, like the government level. I think there's a lot we can do as constituents. One thing I definitely would recommend is make sure that we use our powers as citizens to hold our elected officials accountable. And since the pandemic, like Sharon has mentioned, that like a number of American and Canadian politicians have successfully made inappropriate remarks about Asians or like Chinese Canadians or Americans perpetuating like the coronavirus. And that's very dangerous because these elected officials are basically telling everybody that it's okay to say these things. And we have to make it really loud and clear to them that this type of behavior is not acceptable here. And this can be conveyed in a number of ways. Either being involved in government engagement sessions. I know that there's quite a few advisory councils that started at the municipal level and also the provincial and federal level. So even like simple engagements like that, just to make yourself heard and raising your voice for those who are unable to be there to have a voice is so important. Last but not least, also a shameless plug from the CFRAC end, CRC Consulting also offers a variety of trainings that are on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So if your workplace currently does not have these kind of opportunities available, whoever it might be appropriate, either your supervisor or your human resources department, try to advocate for having those opportunities available, because that's where it's important to have like the open dialogue and like a safe space for people to be able to talk about these things and learn about these things. So yeah.
Those are great, Vivian. Yeah, a lot of power in both at the grassroots level and working all the way up to policy. So those are really good insights. And I think for me, what I want to add to what Vivian was saying is more at the interpersonal level. So I think from my perspective, when entering into these conversations of anti-racism, I think we need to be very principled in multiple ways in our actions for this work. So the first one that I would say we need to be principled in, and this is specifically for the Asian community. I'm sure there's lots of Asian communities out there right now listening to this. I think we need to allow ourselves a space to really process this racial trauma. Because if we're not processing it, when we're always coming into this work from a reactionary sense, it won't really get at the root problem. And the root problem really is white supremacy. And at the same time, I think Asian communities really need to be principled in the ways that we engage or channel our emotions towards the heightened anti-Asian racism that we've been witnessing. So this is not a generalization about Asian Canadians. Just from my personal experience and what I've been noticing is that a lot of Asian communities are coming together during this time to really rally against the anti-Asian violence and racism that's been surging in the wake of COVID-19. And this is really, really great. But what I think is really important to remember is that if we as Asians only start to really engage in this work when it affects our personal lives, but remain silent in the face of other injustices occurring to other racialized communities, or essentially reacting to anti-Asian racism with inherent anti-Blackness, it makes us very complicit in upholding the model minority myth and white supremacy. So I think we really need to come into this process holding an understanding for complexity. And we can do this by first recognizing that cross-racial and cross-cultural coalition and solidarity is very necessary in this work. And this is because the liberation for Asian settlers here on Turtle Island is directly tied to the liberation of other racialized groups as well. So in order to seek this collective liberation then under white supremacy, we really have to invest in both our individual and our collective accountability to stop repeating the behaviors that the system of white supremacy wants or entices us to do. And we can really only achieve this if we perceive this work, we stop perceiving this work as individualistics and from a single lens, and really use a collective narrative to uplift other racialized folks as well. And kind of the second part to what I wanted to bring was, I think we need to be very critical in the ways that we're directing our calls to action for the future. And what I think is really powerful is when we remain attentive to our own positionality and how power really operates and unfolds within these positions, so we don't really further perpetuate any oppression. So for me personally, coming from the social location of an Asian woman, I'm not in a position to be making demands from the Black and Indigenous communities and folks who have ultimately given me this foundation to be engaging in this advocacy work, because making demands like that is very different than engaging in solidarity building. But what I can offer or ask is for white folks to start engaging in this work and really navigating how they hold power and privilege, and how we can use this power and privilege as a platform to then amplify Asian communities.
Thanks, Sam, for sharing. And I do think that you mentioned one point that the Asian groups are really silent, especially when threats happen. So from my role as program service designer, I always think why this happened and how we can do more. From my understanding that I know for me that I totally understand why. So what I kind of try differently in our organization is to have a pilot program to teach the ESL, English as a second language learners, to learn about the basic concepts of this racism or discrimination, the terminologies, and then teach them how they can act or how they can speak up in a softer way if this thing happens again. So I think I do see a change within our new program that if people with language barriers cannot speak up, they may feel comfortable to express what happened in a small group in their native language. And also in this ESL learning interactive and a safe place to learn, they are happy to share their experiences and they will learn how to express their emotions or speak up for themselves in English. So gradually they get involved on to protect or to be at activism later on. So within our organization, this is our first try. So we also want to pilot this program to other communities, not only Chinese community. For example, African community, because we have African clients that's actively involved in ESL learning classes, but do not know anything about racism or discrimination. I think this is quite important for them to learn and then to think about it. So, and also when we think about program design, so there is racism is actually very hard to design or to evaluate somehow these programs. So what I found maybe interesting to implement is to have a separate group. For example, we have ESL kind of groups for maybe Chinese community, and also another group for the white people. So they can start to learn what is a different different cultural community, cultural communication skills to communicate most effectively, efficiently with other groups as well. So in that case, they are more easier to understand others with same background, cultural background. So from us as service providers, we will understand their needs, and then we can design the best fit for their learning or their learning context. So after that, we can mix them up. That is very important for the final step, to mix them up, to let them communicate with each other and to take their learning initiative themselves to get on board within a much broader community discussion. So I think that is some of my ideas or my learnings that I kind of experiences or observed with my 8 months limited working in this field. And also I know that if any of you are interested to evaluate educational programs within this context, I really strongly suggest you to go to the Canadian Evaluation Society. So they have a resource list for you to evaluate anti-racism programs. And I will send the resource later as well.
Thanks, Jing. So I think it was great that we sort of started off with some higher level actions that we can do, and then sort of distilled them down into some more local, more concrete examples. And you sort of touched on the delicate balance that needs to be brought to a conversation with newcomers to Canada about, you know, a group of individuals who probably come with so much hope for their future, only to potentially encounter some really traumatizing and negative experiences that could take away from that hope and optimism, and trying to give them the language and tools to address it and to build that resiliency. So I think that's very important. For my own example, from my work at Catholic Social Services, so we find that one of the best ways to combat some of what goes on in sort of creating an us versus them or an other is really for people to make relationships firsthand with newcomers. And so to learn their stories, to meet them and build relationships, find out where they came from, to explain your own understanding of Canada. And so we have lots of different volunteer opportunities, including those that are virtual. Most of them are actually virtual in this current context, where people can be matched with families that are newly arrived to Canada, one-to-one, to explain a little bit more about the community that they're residing in, or other opportunities where newcomers gather in groups online to learn English and to practice English in a safe space, a facilitated space with a volunteer who's comfortable with English. And so those opportunities just to build bridges with newcomers and just to learn more about the people who are coming to enrich our country is a way to learn more about each other. So I know this is the end of our formal part of the conversation, but I know that there have been a flurry of questions in the chat. So Miriam, how would you like to handle this? Would you like to ask the panelists some questions?
Sure, why don't I do that? Because I have to keep track of the questions as they were coming in. So I will just put them to you, and then whoever would like to speak to it, please go ahead. So one of the first questions I wanted to put forward was strategies for working with, for example, internalized racism. Do you have any recommendations for that?
Can I nominate Sam to speak to that? Are you comfortable, Sam?
Sure, I can speak to that really briefly. So the question was strategies to navigate internalized racism. Was that, Miriam, what it was? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so that's a very complex and nuanced question, because there's going to be so many layers to it. But I think the first thing to do is really target the awareness and understand where kind of the biases or thought process and knowledge is coming from. So like when we're relating this to the model minority myth and how it becomes internalized within our being and our knowledge, we have to understand these are societal and structural conditions that are basically conditioning us to think in certain ways. So it's not because of our culture, it's not because we're certain ways because of we're Chinese or etc. This is part of racism. This is part of how it perpetuates. So I think recognizing that it's not an individual thing, it's not because of some sort of trait within your culture or within your upbringing. This is more rooted systemically. This is rooted in the systems and the ways that white supremacy really works its way into the system and the people that operate within it. So in order for strategies to really come about, we have to recognize that this is the process of how it gets internalized. So just keeping, I guess, awareness of that, to engage in some education. I think engaging in solidarity work with other community members, that can be a way, and I guess to not stay silent when you start to recognize that And if you're around people, you can suggest like getting people to call you in on why your biases or sort of prejudice are coming up and surfacing in certain ways. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but those are some of my preliminary thoughts. Does anyone have any other things to add to that?
I think the only thing I wanted to add, I know that sometimes people want sort of resources or books or things like that that they can read. And I know Jing will be sharing some resources if she hasn't already. I know a book I read recently was just a very different way of describing sort of the dichotomy of where Asians may fit in. It's an American book, so it's an American context, but it's called Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. It's written in the form of a screenplay, which is a little bit different, and it's very short, but it's such a wonderful medium to go through a lot of the issues that we've talked about today, including internalized racism. So if you wanted something a little bit different to engage in, I would recommend that book. Miriam, I think we could probably take the next question.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to post the next question to you here because somebody else actually picked up on that comment as well. So somebody said, I feel that Asian communities are silent and peaceful people, so they are mostly away from protests and rallies. So racism against them are not covered in media, and even other racialized groups are not aware of it. And then somebody commented here that they agree with that, Asian communities, let me just scroll up to it here. Yeah, I agree with Jimmy about silent and peaceful. Asians in North America have the history for fighting for their rights, but it's not taught or highlighted in school. But what are your thoughts on that?
Miriam, can you repeat it quickly? You were cutting out a little bit.
Of course, yes, my apologies. I feel that Asian communities are silent and peaceful people, so they are mostly away from protests and rallies. So racism against them are not covered in media, and even other racialized groups are not aware of it. And then somebody from the audience basically tagged onto that question, also said, I agree with that. Asians in North America have a history for fighting for their rights, but it's not taught or highlighted in school.
I think I can take this question. Of course, I kind of I've been here only for 5 years or 6 years, so I totally understand the point that most Asians that they are not comfortable to speak up, and I think I agree with someone mentioned that we should actually teach kids about racism or how they can behave in or speak up in public. I think it's very important. That the other point I really want to mention here is collaborations. So if we want to have educational programs for kids, we need to collaborate with school board or and also educators who knows the content very well and who can design the programs to fit the needs of the kids and help them to understand in their way. So I think that is important. And the other way, I think, if Asians are not comfortable to speak up, to train them to be aliens to others, to help them to speak up in a group or with peers. It's easier maybe for kids or for the adults. So I think that may kind of change the way of their thinking and the behavior later on. Any other people have other ideas or suggestions?
Yeah, and I think I just wanted to add from personal experience and like just having like my parents and my grandparents' generation, where we don't really talk about these things. This kind of goes back to the intergenerational trauma where this was never brought up about like them being othered or them being wrong. And we, the experience I'd had was they tend to minimize a lot of these situations where they experience trauma, and that is just the way they cope. And we have to acknowledge that not all Asians are comfortable speaking up. And I still remember this very vividly when I was a kid, and I was asking my grandma, well, like my cultural values were they taught us cultural values to not speak up because we value a more harmony in the social relationship over speaking speaking our own opinion. But it's also very conflicting for us when we're navigating that as like the third or fourth generation, because we went through a Canadian education system where we're told that speaking up is critical, especially at a time where we know that we're being wronged. But for Asian Canadians, I think there's that complexity of like the cultural values we're taught about speaking up, but at the same time, not every generation is comfortable doing so. So that could have possibly contributed to that.
Thank you, Vivian. Does one of the other panelists want to speak to this as well? Otherwise, I would move on to the next question. We've got a number of really excellent questions coming in. So the next question is, how can non-Asian allies condemn wrongful actions of governments running Asian countries without contributing to stigma discrimination against Asian people? What language could be used to prevent making a false correlation between the wrongful actions of a government and the ethnic features that Western people associate with the area of the world that the government runs? It's a very complex question. I can also put it into the chat again if that would help.
Yeah, that's a really complicated question. And I mean, I think what we've touched on at a couple of different points today is really just being comfortable living in the complexity, because I mean, all of us have an origin story. All of us come from a place. Some of us are, I mean, all of us are living dual identities with roots here and potentially roots somewhere else, but those roots are complicated, right? Depending on the migration story and the reasons for leaving, and maybe the reasons for going back or not going back. So it's hard to say how you would have those, like if you're having an individual conversation, it's being open to sort of asking people about how they feel, right? Because everybody's going to have a different relationship with where they come from and their political beliefs or their motivations. And so it is so complicated. So, I mean, I think our message today, a lot of it is about opening up that dialogue and wanting to come from a place of understanding and asking questions and being open to hearing someone's experiences. And so, you know, I don't know, Jing, if you want to speak to this too, but there are all sorts of assumptions when you say you're from a certain place or your family's from a certain place, and some of those things may be true, but some of those are entirely assumptions, right? And so it's really about unpacking those assumptions and not making any without basis for them. So I don't know, Jing, if you'd like to speak to that.
Thanks, Shara. I think you mentioned a really good point that for other group of racial groups, what the best way we can do is to really sit down and listen and try to be open-minded, try to analyze your kind of bias by digesting all the stories you heard, all the experiences you heard. You will understand your culture better and also understand yourself better. Because we actually had a community anti-racism program. We have 6 weeks educational program, and it's a mixed ethnic kind of cultural groups discussion. So there's one community members who came to our program want to understand why she was being called racist. So at the end, that's when we kind of really reflect deeply on what happened on the entire learnings. She reflect back of her childhood experiences. It seems like the only time she knows about Chinese is the time her parents bring her to a Chinese restaurant. So that is the only context or settings that she started to know what is Chinese or culture or food. So that may reflect back now that maybe some of her behaviors that could be kind of negatively influenced about others. So I think from her learnings, we know that she could be better, try to integrate with other cultures, and then through these all experiences that she will understand her better. So I think for the white group people that who want to really help visible minority people, that it is a really good way that you can listen and really understand what happened to them and understand the difference.
Great, thank you so much. One other question that also came up, and it's a similar question gets asked most of the times when we have these sessions, and it's basically what can all of us do to make our friends and colleagues who are of Asian descent feel more comfortable, or how can we be an ally to them, especially in the current climate that we're having?
I can start this conversation for this question. I think the most important thing is to stop waiting for the right time to speak up about it. Because there's never going to be a right time to speak up against anti-Asian racism and violence. And waiting for the perfect time or waiting for the perfect response, there's never going to be the most perfect response, or if you keep waiting, that's also not going to solve any issues. And the whole idea of having to be perfect in this work really is a colonialist idea that we sort of embody, which is kind of against the whole notion of anti-racism. So we have to be open to engaging in this work, but also learning in the process at the same time. And I think silence, and especially for white folks out there, white silence, which is kind of cloaked behind the idea of everyone's just continuing to listen and learn from Asian communities, really just adds to the racial oppression and violence, because there's not going to be any tangible action that's involved with actually dismantling the system of white supremacy, while still seeming like they're doing something because they're trying to listen to the narratives. But I think awareness is very necessary in this work, but progress towards dismantling these oppressive conditions and these structures can't occur in the state of awareness and education. We require action, and progress requires action. And I think in this matter, there's really an urgency, because we no longer can afford to not tangibly engage or remain silent, because the longer we wait or the more silent we become, we will continue to see violence, we will continue to see death. So I think I would emphasize on action, and not just sitting back and trying to listen to everything that's going on, and really taking an active responsibility in this matter, while amplifying and centering the work of the Asian community when we're talking about anti-Asian racism. And on the flip side, I think when people start engaging in this work more, it'll be important to also recognize that you'll be entering into an ongoing conversation within the broader anti-racism movement. So acknowledging the activists who have provided the platform for people to enter into this space is also necessary. So I think it's really just finding a balance between centering the Asian experience, recognizing the labors of minoritized communities, while using privilege, and for white folks, using your white privilege to really in ways that can productively continue the goals of anti-racism. And essentially we can do this by questioning where existing knowledge comes from or how biases and power have really entered into these spaces. And when we're talking about anti-Asian racism, how xenophobia and xenophobia have always existed within Canada's long history of anti-Asian sentiment, but it's critical to self-reflect on the ways that kind of seeps into our thought process and really unlearn those ideas.
Thank you, Sam. Does one of the other panelists want to speak to this as well? Okay. I have one more question. I would say let's have this as the last question and then we wrap it up. So actually this question is mainly for you, Sam. So you had a brief discussion about toxic masculinity, emasculation, and the model minority myth. What are some thoughts about how can we approach others to unlearn, educate, improve?
So specifically on unlearning like toxic masculinity was the question referring to, or just unlearning in general?
Yeah, I emphasized the toxic masculinity, so I think that is what it is geared towards.
Okay, yeah. So also a very complex topic and matter. But I think when we're approaching this topic, we have to really navigate how these ideas become internalized, like for everybody, and how, yeah, we have to approach it with an openness and an understanding that this is also probably a very touchy and sensitive topic for a lot of people. So I think, yeah, I think Sharon kind of talked about this earlier about an openness to navigate these complex issues with holding a nuance to this topic. But I am not sure specifically an answer, a strategy for that. I think, yeah, just being open and aware and educating yourself on how you also can perpetuate these toxic masculine norms within the larger idea of the patriarchy, and how that really intersects for the Asian population, I think will be key when we're talking specifically for Asians who either are perceived or identify as being a man. Yeah, but these are all very insightful questions, and there's not going to be one right answer to it, to these ideas, because yeah, this is all very new and complex for the whole world. So yeah, I'd be open to hearing what anyone else has to say about it.
It's more a little bit kind of harking back to the previous question, but because I mean, I think this question gets asked a lot about the ally and what you can do. And I think Sam's answer was really comprehensive in trying to tackle the question at a lot of different levels, at a systems level, at a community level. But I guess on a smaller scale, after the mass shootings in Georgia, I had lots of colleagues in my office just ask me how I was doing, and just opening up that dialogue and having the space to talk about it, right? Just so that I knew that they were a safe space to talk about it. And so if you have people in your life that you haven't ever brought up that conversation before, even asking that question is a door that's now open, that they know that, you know, you might be an ally and you might be someone who they could go to for some of the greater change that Sam talked about, right? Because I think within organizations or within communities, we need each other in order to make some of those systemic changes that will be really difficult to make. And so I think that's a small step. If you wanted something concrete, is just to yourselves be open to talking about that and listening as a starting point for the people that you know.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Do the other panelists maybe also just want to add some closing words? And I'd also like to invite our audience to please complete our feedback form. We have posted the link in the chat box. Again, receiving your feedback is really helpful for us also in order to tailor future events and to see what we can improve. So we would really like to encourage you. It will only take a minute, but in the meantime, we will just have some closing comments.
For sure. And I think I would just like to wrap up echoing Sam and Sharon's sentiment about just really normalizing these conversations and having an open dialogue whenever possible. And like the starting small, I think like we can always try to like incorporate these conversations a little bit more casually, and maybe day to day, like hang out with friends for dinner. It can just be anything about like, oh, have you heard about like the news recently? It doesn't probably have to be the news, but just chatting about our community. And like for all of us who are somewhat involved in the sector, I believe like racism is definitely a topic that would be ongoing, and just like chatting about work, making this seem normal and gradually kind of get into like the details if that conversation gets that far about like what can we do on the grassroots levels, or like what can we do in our like prospective jobs that we can start change from the bottom level. So yeah, I think I just want to conclude and thank you everybody for such insightful conversations and great questions. Like Sam said, there's no one right answer to answer any of these questions, and I believe it'll still be a work in progress in the near future. And yeah, it takes a community of people to achieve such a big goal. So we're happy to have you on board with us today.
Okay, well, we have come to the end of today's event. So thank you everyone who attended. We always appreciate your interest in our events. And if you want to keep updated on any upcoming events, please visit our website, or you can also reach out by email if you have any suggestions for collaboration.